Ready to go?
Yeah.
All right, camera rolling.
Sound recording.
Oh wait, yep, camera's rolling.
Yep. All right, fine. Frame.
Yeah.
All right, take one.
A bad batch of drugs is being blamed for the death of a man in Melbourne and the hospitalisations of 20 more people. It's believed all of them took MDMA.
Police allege the drugs he sold around Chapel Street contain toxic chemicals and may have contributed to the death of 3 people over the weekend. The French national, who is in Australia on a working visa, was arrested at the Revolver Upstairs nightclub. Police claim more than 20 people overdosed on the weekend. 5 of them had been at Revolver. The venue said in a statement, these drugs can cause violent reactions, severe hallucinations, and may result in death.
A batch of drugs like this generally will take a long time to disappear from a scene. Now, MDMA is a very popular drug. We're aware of that.
Just say no. Just don't use drugs. Drugs are bad. We've been trying that message for 50, 60 years or so. It has not reduced the amount of drugs that Australians take. In fact, Australians take more MDMA than any other country per capita in the world. You know, we are the ecstasy kings and queens of the world.
You know, we all wanted to get pretty messed up that night, so we organised through our mate to pick up a bunch of what we thought would be caps of MDMA that night. And when our friend met up with the dealer, he thought we meant pills instead of caps. And so we're like, oh, okay, sure, so we'll just take them anyway, you know, it's whatever. And I remember the pills, they were white with a Soviet Union sigil on them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hammer and sickle and everything, man.
Yeah, and I had to work the next day, so I thought, fuck, it's already 3 in the morning. I should just crash in bed. I'll just go to bed. And this is where I start to sort of feel the effects of what I'd just taken. So I went into bed. I turned the lights off and I get into bed. I started feeling really restless and like kind of unwell, sort of like there was just this feeling of something was not right. And then I opened my eyes and the layout of my room was just not right. Like the walls weren't connecting at the right angles. I had this Andy Warhol artwork up in the center of my room of a gorilla and his face is just moving about and just, I was just like, this is not happening. Like this can't happen. This is fucked up. And then that's when I just went to panic mode. So I started like really hyperventilating, like breathing heavily, and then I get up, jump off my bed, and I just see my chest just sort of like pop out like that.
How different could the scenarios have been if on-site pill testing was available?
It's the difference between life and death. It's the difference between people ending up in hospital, losing their lives, overdosing, becoming sick, to people acknowledging that the drugs that they had bought in this instance weren't what they were meant to be and saying, I don't want to take that. I have the information, empowering people to be able to say, no, actually, I'd rather just have a quiet night than end up dead.
See, he had 3 of like the batch in question, right? I had 3 caps of MD and I only took 1 of those pills that we're talking about. And I felt awful. Like the first half of the night, I felt fantastic because I was just kind of buzzing off the MD a little bit. About an hour later, I already kind of felt the effects kicking in. I could kind of feel that my body wasn't exactly reacting the way that I wanted it to. Nothing was like, the signals being sent from my brain weren't reaching my limbs properly, if that makes sense. Everything felt like distorted, but not in the type of way that you'd kind of enjoy when you're taking these like recreational drugs. The one thing that really was like unsettling about the whole situation was how like weak and brittle your body felt. Like your bones, my bones felt like toothpicks.
Yeah.
Like I felt like they'd snap at just like the slightest bit of pressure. And like,
felt kind of defeated.
yeah.
I think this is all about providing the right information to young people. So in schools and in other institutions where it's the just say no method that's been going since the 1980s and has just ended up nowhere. The war on drugs is just absolutely killing people worldwide and is taking us nowhere. We need to be able to give people the right information to say, these substances are available. You might enjoy taking them, you might absolutely hate them, but you need to have that balanced information available to people so they can make the right choices for themselves.
Should we do the reenactment?
Go for it.
So, all right, you lie down.
He comes up to me and is like, man, can you just like comfort me for a little bit? And I was like, yeah, sure. Like, come here, man.
So it was literally like this. It was like this, and I think
Patting him on the back and just comforting him for like...
We stayed like that for the next 8 hours, just...
Well, it felt like 8 hours.
Yeah.
Look, this is the real issue, and the argument against drug testing is that it encourages drug use. And I hear that regularly, particularly from my parliamentary colleagues, that, this will only help the drug dealers. This will encourage people to take drugs. There's no evidence of that. We know people are going to take drugs. And as we saw early this year, not terrible effect, not only getting very sick, but killing people. So that argument is one that we have to counter. And we have to counter that through the way that we run our drug testing programs, and that they need to be very much around a harm minimisation approach. But we do know for a fact that drug testing does not increase drug use. In fact, if anything, it reduces it. But it's a hard argument to get through. And it's the same as, supervised injecting centres. You say, look, people are going to use these drugs. I mean, we're giving them syringes and clean needles and clean water, but so we know they're taking the drugs, but we're not ensuring that they take them in a safer manner as they could. So it's that same analogy that we need things like drug testing, we need things like supervised injecting to ensure that we minimise the harm of that drug use as much as possible.
So the Institute's responsible for all coronial deaths, investigation of coronial deaths, and also a range of services provided to Victoria Police. That includes injured drivers, deceased drivers, drivers who are impaired by drugs, and also drug facilitated crime cases. There are not many overdoses from ecstasy per se. I wouldn't say it's a safe drug, but there aren't all that many deaths associated with ecstasy unless taken in overdose. What my understanding is, in this batch of ecstasy, there were other products found, such as 4-fluoroamphetamine, otherwise known as 4FA or FIFA or Flux as it's commonly known on the street, combined with another drug called 25C Nbomi, or the N-bomb type drugs. Now, 4-fluoroamphetamine is a stimulant. It's quite a strong stimulant. It's similar to methamphetamine. And 25C Nbomi is a hallucinogen, so a very potent hallucinogen. That was a drug designed by a pretty amazing chemist called Alexander Shulgin, who developed some of these psychoactive drugs to see whether they had any therapeutic effect. None was found for these drugs, but they are still around and they're still manufactured illicitly. So this is a working laboratory. We have some 35 people here undertaking a range of tests for coronial cases and also police cases. So most of these rooms contain highly specific and sensitive instruments that are used to measure drugs and poisons. So we've got good experience in being able to detect drugs and developing our appreciation of some of the some of the newer drugs. So the new synthetic drugs that we spoke about, we're trying to increase that capacity to test as many of those as possible.
Yep.
Which is why people take them, because they remain largely undetectable. And if you're working, there are places that do test for drugs. Not all workplaces will test for these drugs or can test for these drugs.
So it's still in that grey area.
Yes, yes, but they are scheduled, they are drugs that are banned and no longer available legitimately. The problem is that these in combination can lead to significant cardiovascular risk, so effects on the heart, so they increase your rate of your heart rate, will increase your blood pressure, they can lead to seizures. If taken an overdose, they can lead to psychosis, irrational behaviour, so people become aggressive or they do things that they normally wouldn't do. For example, jump off balconies, running through the streets naked. So these drugs have significant adverse effects, but we know that they also can affect your heart and your brain function, and they can lead to death. We know that from overseas that these drugs in combination have led to deaths, and drugs in their own right have also led to people dying. So when an ecstasy user thinks that they're buying ecstasy, end up getting a combination of a stimulant and a hallucinogen, and they're potent drugs, that's where the problems arise. And had those users known that potentially that bad batch of ecstasy contained these, I suspect that most of those users wouldn't have actually taken those drugs. So these form part of the illicit group. So we have laboratories here that conduct, scientists that conduct a whole range of tests, not only in blood, in urine, but also in hair. So drugs stay in hair for a long time. If you've got very short hair, it means that we've only got a small window of opportunity to test whether you've used a drug in the last month or so. But if you've got really long hair, you've got years potentially where you can detect drugs in someone's hair. It's like rings in a tree. So we have another laboratory here. We share the laboratory with another scientific area. But all the toxicology and pill testing can happen using highly sensitive equipment called mass spectrometers. So we've got some of those in here. So we've got, come through, just carry on. So these instruments here, these are liquid chromatographs mass spectrometers, and they are highly sensitive pieces of equipment that are used to essentially get a fingerprint of the drug. So we know that it's methamphetamine, or we know that it's ecstasy, or we know that it's cannabis. So we can identify drugs at very, very low levels in a variety of different matrices. So they're not cheap, they're about $500,000 each.
Yeah.
And we use this one for hair, use this one for oral fluid, and we use the others for general drug screens. So this is fully working.
It's quite the lab, Dimitri.
It's hard to put this in a mobile space.
Oh, for sure.
You can't replace this and put this in a mobile facility to do pill testing. So really, you need one of these to be able to cover as many drugs as you can, but that's not always possible. So we have a number of other instruments. These are gas chromatographs, so these would be available at pill testing sites.
Yep.
They're a lot easier to operate and don't require as many attachments.
Mobile.
Yeah, so we do blood alcohol analysis here, we do some general drug analysis, but it's hard to replicate a large laboratory like this in a mobile space. You can get small mobile laboratories that have good capacity now to pick up a range of drugs, but it's almost impossible to replicate a laboratory facility, at a venue or at a party.
I guess for budget reasons as well.
Yeah, it's cost. The sheer cost of running a laboratory, ensuring that the instruments are up and running, that they're calibrated, that they're working well. That requires a degree of stability in the environment.
That's totally understandable. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
When you're out and about on a Saturday night in Paran or Chapel Street, you might encounter the police and sniffer dogs as part of Operation Safe Night. Here's what you need to know. Before a search, it's your responsibility to know how to deal with the police. So what is a search? The police can run their hands over you. They can ask you to remove your jacket or your jumpers and also to turn out your pockets. After the search, the police should give you a record of anything they've seized from you. Make sure you ask the police officer what their name, rank and station is. And lastly, make sure you record step by step what happened to you and seek legal advice. Thanks for tuning in. We hope you found this helpful. For more information, go to highalert.com.au and be alert and very alarmed. Well, it's a very contrarian name, and I would start by saying I don't think it's made the nights any safer. So Operation Safe Night was a reaction by the Victorian Police to the tragic overdoses and deaths that occurred in Chapel Street earlier this year, where people unknowingly took a substance thinking it was MDMA. So instead of reframing drug policy or working with the community or consulting experts or consulting stakeholders, the police launched this attack on the nightlife. But we found along the campaign that the focus shifted a lot. So at the start of the campaign, the initial press release, which has since been taken offline, noted that this was a road safety campaign, which is a bit strange considering it was meant to be about policing drugs. And then every time the police would go out and they wouldn't get the results they thought they were going to get, the tact seemed to change. The PR strategy seemed to change. So again, safe night, not very safe.
Yeah, if only that was what Safe Night did, you know,
it's a bit ironic.
made the night safer. No, I think it has had an impact on nightlife. I think it's made people nervous. I think it has damaged the relationship of police with young people in that area. I think it has reduced the amount of trust, which means that when a young person is in trouble, they may not contact police when they should. So if anything, I think it has made it more dangerous. I have certainly heard from some of the nightclubs that people are choosing not to go out in Chapel Street now. They're choosing to go to other places. So I think it's certainly reduced the patronage around that very popular night area. And also, the social factor. Like, if you look at something like the Poof Doof, which is on in Chapel Street, now that is actually a really important event for young people working out some of their sexuality. So when you look at the people who go to something like Poof Doof, they come from all of the outer suburbs, and this gives them an opportunity to meet other people, other gay men and women, to gain some confidence around their sexuality. And so we're actually made people scared to go to that event.
So my research over the last year and a half has actually been focused specifically on the impacts of things like sniffer dogs in harm reduction. And although sniffer dogs are really put forth by the police as being a harm reduction intervention and about sending a message and deterring people from taking drugs, what my research has shown, and that's involved observations of the operations in action as well as interviews with people who've been searched by the dogs. And what my research shows, and it backs up some earlier similar kinds of research, is that the drug detection dogs are not deterring people from taking drugs whatsoever. None of the people that I spoke to said that they would stop their drug use or reduce their drug use as a result of the drug detection dogs. So what instead people choose to do is change the ways in which they take drugs or carry drugs, for example, into these kind of spaces. So everyone I spoke to talked about the kind of different sorts of adaptations they would do in response to the drug dogs, all of which, or nearly all of which, actually increase harms rather than decrease harms. So people talked about, for example, having experiences where they would panic on seeing the drug dogs and take all of their drugs at once, which of course raises big risks of overdose and potential overdose fatalities. Other people talked about doing things like preloading, so taking their drugs before arriving at a festival or nightlife precinct, stashing drugs internally, so in internal anus, vaginal cavities, for example, things that they wouldn't have normally done before the drug dogs being there. Others also talked about switching to drugs like GHB and acid, which, for example, are not as easily detectable or not detectable by the drug dogs. Those kinds of changes in drug use practices can pose particular risks because certain drugs like GHB are far less easy for people to ensure that they don't overdose, especially if they're less familiar with using those drugs. And other people talked about buying drugs inside festivals or premises rather than bringing in their own drugs from a known supplier, which again raises other kinds of risks to do with overdose and other accidents and injury. So unfortunately, the Operation Safe Night will change, I believe, based on my research at a whole range of other festivals. It will change the nightlife, but not for the better. So it won't do the sorts of things that the police and government are hoping it will do. I think instead it will increase harms. And in fact, we did see a couple of hospitalisations to do with GHB in June, only a month or two after Operation Safe Night began, and I can't be sure, but it's highly likely that kind of thing is a response of the kind of adaptations people do to these kind of intensive police operations, particularly with drug detection dogs.
When we introduce drug driving tests that do not test for impairment, but measure minute traces of a illicit drug in the system, well beyond any intoxication, well past any intoxication. Sometimes 7 days these drugs can be tested in the system or still have residues that will show up on these tests. Now, my point is those invasive tests that are not a safety issue because they're not stopping people driving with drugs, they're stopping people having a minute previous drug use with a small amount in their system. There was no public outcry. There was no question of civil liberties. This was an anti-drug measure and it got up. So my point is there is a progression of these laws, and will these laws eventually be expanded? Look, yes, where do you go with the prohibition? Where does it end? How are we going to stop people using drugs? The purveyors of prohibition well ask themselves. Well, if you're in the Philippines, we can take them out and shoot them. That's a good idea. If you're in Australia, well, look, why don't we examine everybody's shit? That's a good idea. Now, that'll allow us to get some big societal pictures of how many people are using illicit substances. But my point here again is overreach, so now we can certainly test, measures use in the whole society. But then what if we start to examine people's garbage bins for traces of a roach? There's a good idea. We can therefore isolate a person that has been in the proximity of cameras. We can charge them. We can arrest them for their own good. We can force them to go into rehabilitation. We can help them. Now, you see the totalitarian dangers of this sort of logic. It is a take, and this does look at the libertarian element. So when you've got police with increased powers in nightclubs because they want to stop drugs, yes, there will be creep in time, and that creep will increase to the point where it becomes unacceptable and society arcs up. There's another massive trend here that's worrying I'll just comment upon, and this is the trend of lawmakers to treat drug use, drug dealing on the same level as terrorism. And I know it seems a stretch, but this is again, we're so blind to what's going on in our world, like frogs in a pot of boiling water. The militarisation of the drug war has happened in Australia, although we haven't noticed. It's happened in America, and we have noticed, where they sold billions of dollars of army excess equipment down to local bloody sheriff's office, who now have ram raids and armoured vehicles and all of this riot gear. And the history is to fight the war on drugs. No-knock raids where they can come in with a large machine, knock your front door down, throw in a grenade, a stun grenade, and then come in. All on the name of information about drug use. So the war on drugs has been militarised on every level, and these encroachments on civil liberties, certain areas where you have no right to resist a search, and I'm talking invasive searches here. These are cavity searches as well. If the police can put a case that there is some suspicion. Well, what suspicion? A dog blinking at you could be indication of a suspicion. So the human rights and the liberties angles of the prohibition are increasing like a vice that just is getting wound in and wound in and wound in. And it's been happening since the 70s.